Hello there, and welcome to the Biome Podcast. I'm Graham, and this is the podcast all about zoology and ecology. Today, we have some subtle differences in how the podcast is being handled. If you're listening to this via Spotify or any of the other podcasting apps, then you might not realize it, but this is our very first video podcast. If you want, feel free to visit our website at thebiomepodcast.com, and you can click the link to find our YouTube channel and watch this entire podcast via video. Another change in this particular podcast is that we are doing a interview. So we have a very lovely guest joining us today, and they will be talking about their experiences at the Calgary Wildlife Rehab Centre, as well as tips and tricks and things to do and not do when you find yourself with a animal that you feel might be either distressed or even a juvenile that needs help. So stick around for that. In the meantime, before we get there, let's talk about our trivia question. Our trivia question last episode was, what animal is effectively immortal? And we had some people found it a little difficult, some people didn't. We have three answers here, and they come from James Patterson, Samantha Mary, and Charlotte Maria. Congratulations to all three of those. The correct answer is the backward aging jellyfish, also known as the immortal jellyfish, for obvious reasons. It is a small jellyfish found worldwide in temperate waters. It is the most famous species, although there are a few other species. We won't get into those just yet, but this one is the most famous one. It is able to revert completely from a sexually mature adult all the way back to its sexually immature juvenile stage, or in this case known as a colony stage or a polyp stage. Basically, they can revert back to these childlike or infantile stages in response to environmental stresses, physical assault or attack, even if they get sick or when they get old. So what this means is that, theoretically speaking at least, this jellyfish is immortal. It can live as long as it needs to. As soon as it gets old, it just reverts back to its polyp stage, and then it begins the cycle all over again. Really, really fascinating stuff. We might explore it in one of our upcoming episodes. Haven't quite decided yet. But if you want to see more about it, either send us an email, contact us on our website, or in the sake of this, or in the sake of this video, just leave us a comment down below. Now, as for this week's trivia question, let's see who can answer it. I will give a shout out to the first three people that answer it correctly, as well as I'll tag them on social media if possible. So make sure that you include your name in the email, make sure you include your answer, and if you want to shout out on social media, make sure you include your social media handles. You can send your emails to questions at thebiomepodcast.com. You can visit us on the website at www.thebiomepodcast.com, or feel free to leave a comment down below. I'm going to guess, since this is our first video on YouTube, there aren't going to be many people following. But if you do see it, feel free to leave us a comment. We are always looking for suggestions, comments, criticisms even, and any way we can make things better. So, as for today's question, how many times can a hummingbird flap its wings per second? Again, how many times can a hummingbird flap its wings per second? So, just as a reminder, feel free to email us at questions@thebiomepodcast.com. Feel free to send us a message on the contact form. Feel free to comment down below, or if you're listening via Spotify, feel free to leave us a message, a voice message. Now, One last time, let's go over that question. How many times can a hummingbird flap its wings per second? I also want to suggest that you have a look at our website and go view the field notes that we have there. They come out every week, and some of them are great fun. The past one was about the European hare. So have a look at it and enjoy. For now, though, let's get on with today's show. I have an exceptionally exciting show for you today. I have a very close friend joining me. Tijana Selak has graduated from zoology, is currently doing her master's, has worked for the Calgary Wildlife Rehab Center, has worked for the Calgary Zoo, and is joining us today to talk about some of her experiences. How are you, Tijana?
I'm awesome, Graham. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for joining us. First, I wanted to talk a bit about your experiences with the Wildlife Center. Is there anything that you remember? You're not still working with them, are you? Or are you still volunteering with them?
I'm not at this time. I volunteered with the center for almost a decade and worked with them in a wildlife technician role a couple summers ago. And it's very near and dear to my heart and kind of the root of where a lot of my interest in urban wildlife stems from and some of the things that we're going to talk about today.
That's fantastic. Yeah, every time I remember talking to you, I remember hearing about the Wildlife Rehab Center, and it's always struck me as a great place to not only gain experience, but also to grow your enthusiasm for, as you said, urban wildlife.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a really great kind of jumping off point for me. As you mentioned, I did my bachelor's in zoology, which is how we met. I did my undergrad research on urban wildlife, or specifically the impact of urbanization on wildlife, and just kind of fell in love with these, really resilient and tenacious animals that live amongst us. And the Wildlife Center was a really cool way to meet some of that local fauna and get some hands-on experience and gain some knowledge as to how we can all play a role in helping them out.
Absolutely. That leads me to my first question, actually, which is probably coming out of nowhere, but is there a specific species that really resonates with you?
Oh, gosh, there's a lot of animals that I really love and respect and appreciate. As far as wildlife in and amongst Calgary, I've got to say my favorites are probably the corvids, which is sort of an unpopular opinion amongst non-wildlife folk. But yeah, ravens, magpies, crows, they're just so incredibly intelligent and charismatic and fun to work with, mischievous and, all that. But they're definitely up there.
That adds a certain depth to playing around with them, right? Is their whole mischievous attitude.
Absolutely.
Are there any highlights with any of the organizations that you've worked with? Are there any highlights that really stuck with you and something that you think back on and think back fondly on?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I would say, as far as my experience in wildlife rehab, just being able to work with a variety of wildlife and getting to know some of the really cool species that live in our city that a lot of people might be surprised about. And it's such rewarding work to be able to, watch baby animals grow up or watch injured individuals recover and know that you were a part of that is really, really cool. On the education side of things, you mentioned the zoo. I worked as a wildlife conservation educator at the zoo for 4 years, and that was a really rewarding experience in its own way. I worked mostly with people in that role, and animals assisted me in it. My love of animals stemmed from, my childhood memories of my favorite science communicators, like the Krapp brothers and Jane Goodall and Steve Irwin. So, being able to kind of pass my passion on to the next generation and think that maybe I can influence them to love and respect wildlife the way that my science educators and heroes did for me is just, I don't know, it's a really cool thought. And lots of really fond memories.
That's brilliant. Any specific species that you worked with at, because you, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, you worked pretty closely with some owls at the Wildlife Rehab Center, did you not?
I did, yeah. So, in addition to my role as a wildlife technician, I also did outreach education with the Wildlife Center. And so, we had a couple resident animals, which are individuals who unfortunately weren't well enough to be released, but still had a lot of life left in them, would stay in the center as education ambassadors. And so, I
Nice.
worked with a Swainson's hawk and a great horned owl specifically to educate youth about wildlife and kind of what you can do if you should ever run into an injured animal out and about the city.
Nice. And okay, I do remember you really enjoyed the Great Horned Owl, correct? You were very
I
fond
did.
of it.
I did. I still am. Her name is Ophelia, and she's got to be my favorite raptor out there. She's a real gem.
They are. Yeah, they are special birds. That's for sure. With regards to the Wildlife Rehab Center, what were the busiest times that you found?
Right now.
Really?
Right now, heading into spring. Yeah. So, with a lot of animals returning from their annual migrations, and of course, a lot of baby animals being born in the springtime, going into May, June, July was definitely the busiest time of year. And I'm sure still is.
By a significant portion?
By a significant portion. Yeah. And one of the reasons for that is due to the public's sort of lack of information or lack of education on what an injured or orphaned animal looks like. So, a lot of the animals that were brought into the center did not actually need to be there, but alas, they came. And so that's one of the things I really wanted to chat with you about today is to kind of know the difference between an animal that's all right and one that's in need of help so that you can kind of assist your local wildlife center this
Absolutely.
spring in helping those critters out.
Absolutely, because I'm assuming that if it comes in and it doesn't look injured or it doesn't look like it needed to be there, um, especially if it's an adult one, you still want to check it out, right? Which is still going to take up resources. You're still at least going to, I'm going to guess, keep it overnight, which will still mean possibly feeding it. So it's still going to be a strain on the wildlife center. It's still going to take up space.
Yeah, the resources are part of it, but the bigger issue is that for those baby animals, their best chance at survival is with their mother.
Right,
And so if you have with the best intentions, but again, a lack of education,
right,
taken that animal from the wild and brought it to our center, the odds of us reuniting it with that parent are slim to none.
right,
And it can't be released on its own. So now it will have to stay at the wildlife center until it is an adult and until it can fend for itself. And with that comes the risk that it becomes habituated during its rehabilitation. And of course, that leads to issues upon its release. So we really, really want to urge people to call your wildlife center when in doubt
right.
before you bring any animal in and learn what you can so that you can spot the signs of an animal that might be absolutely fine just exactly where it is.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. What were some of the most common species that you got to work with at the rehab center?
So birds were definitely the big one. We got everything from raptors, corvids, waterfowl, songbirds, woodpeckers, lots and lots of birds. But we would also see a lot of hares, squirrels, occasionally beavers or deer. So a great variety.
Yeah, absolutely. Hares, that just reminded me. They're like the parent doesn't actually spend the day with the young, do they? They're the young usually grow up in a nest underneath the grass, and the parents usually leave them for most of the day, correct? So a lot of people, I would assume, find them during the day when they're mowing their lawn, and then think that they've probably been abandoned.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And again, this is well intentioned. You know, if you
Sure.
saw a human child on their own, that's cause for concern, right? And so when we see other small vulnerable animals, especially mammals on their own, we assume that they must be in trouble. But you're absolutely right for hares and also for deer. This is true. the mom does not spend a lot of time with the babies. And that's partially because she's got to go off to feed and can't take them all with her. And also partially because the babies are virtually scentless at that
Oh,
young age. However, the mother is not. So she wants to kind of get away from her babies to avoid attracting predators to them. And what
right.
she will do to, ensure that at least some of them will survive if a predator does find them, is she'll actually split them up. So a mother hare will kind of get her babies to spread out. She'll ask them to kind of stay where they are till she goes off to, and it's usually really only at dawn and dusk twice a day that she'll come back to visit and to feed them. So it is perfectly normal for them to be alone for hours at a time, which is why we often say, if you find a hare, leave it there, because unless you're seeing visible signs of injury or stress, so unless they're crying out or they're bleeding, limping, something really alarming, we
Right.
really encourage people to just leave it there and watch from a distance. And there's a really good chance that mom will return by the time the sun goes down. So nothing to worry about there.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So what should a person without rehab or vet experience do when they find a animal that they think might be injured, or as a baby, which you just mentioned, is probably just leave it there?
Yeah, so we can chat about a couple babies in a minute because it does sort of depend on the animal. But I would say, in general, if you find an animal that is injured, and again, we're looking for visible signs of injury, limping, unable to support its own head, bleeding, something like that, first you want to observe the situation and kind of see if it's even safe for you to approach. So, are they in your backyard or are they in the middle of the road? Assess the situation, kind of similar to first aid, right? Um,
Absolutely.
Confirm that they're actually in trouble. And again, if you're in doubt, call your local wildlife center. Here in Calgary, we've only got the one, Calgary Wildlife Rehabilitation Society, and you can call their hotline and they will walk you through it. You can even send them photos or videos if you're unsure, and they'll help you out. Um, if it is a small animal like a bird or a squirrel or a hare, and you are certain that they're injured, the Wildlife Center does not do rescues. So you're going to have to bring that animal in yourself. So, what
Okay.
I would recommend you do is you grab something like a towel or a blanket, wear gloves if you can, protect yourself, and you're going to very gently, very carefully, very quietly scoop that little critter up. You can place them in a appropriately sized box where you think they're going to be comfortable. You're going to pop them quietly in the back of your car, nice, quiet, dark environment for them, and take them to your local wildlife center. And upon arrival, they will take care of the rest for you. But I would really say, if you're looking at a carnivore or a large mammal, so we're talking something like a deer or a coyote, that is best left to the professionals. So again, just call your local wildlife center. They'll walk you through the next steps. But for those little ones, that's all you got to do.
No, that makes perfect sense. Now, I do know that some adult birds specifically will actually will pretend to be injured to try and lead predators away from their young at times. Is that anything that's ever found around Calgary?
That sounds like a mischievous corvid. Yeah, I have heard of things like that. And quite often in these situations where we're dealing with uh, especially young baby wildlife, the parents are nearby. So when I say observe the situation, look up, look down, look all around. In the case of young birds, the parents are often in the nearest tree. You might even hear them, especially if we're looking at corvids or raptors.
Right.
In the case of something like a hawk, they might actually be trying to dive bomb you to get you the heck away from their babies. So
Magpies as well.
look around and you'll see a lot of really interesting behaviors in the spring, but that is a possibility for sure.
Okay, perfect. And now you said that you kind of touched on what to do if you come across a baby, is look around, assess the situation. Is this for all babies, or are there any that should actually be with their parent, and if you don't see their parent, then chances are there's something wrong?
That's a really great question. Let's chat about birds because that's probably the most common baby that you'll see in the springtime.
Sounds good.
And what you will do upon finding it depends actually on the type of bird and how old it is. So let's say we're looking at a songbird. So something like maybe a chickadee or a sparrow, a small little singing bird. It depends on the age. So if you're looking at this bird, let's say you find it on the ground and it doesn't have a lot of feathers. It's looking kind of naked, kind of weird, like a little alien. You are most likely looking at a hatchling or a nestling. So at this stage of its life, this baby bird should be in the nest. If you're
Okay.
finding it by itself on the ground, it has been misplaced from its nest. Could be a windy day, could be a predator. What you're going to do with this baby is you are going to figure out where that nest is, look up, look around, and you're going to want to return that baby to the nest if you
Oh,
can.
okay.
Yeah. And this surprises a lot of people because there is this kind of common myth that goes around that you are not meant to touch a baby bird or a baby animal because then the mom will reject it or not want it
Right.
back. And this is a fallacy. This is not true. Most mothers, regardless of species, very much want their baby back. And the scent thing is really funny because most birds have a really weak sense of smell. So
Okay.
that mom is not going to detect you.
Yeah.
The reason I think that this myth was born is just to discourage people from touching wildlife. Because again, most babies are scentless. And if you put your scent on that baby, you're going to attract predators to that little guy. So,
Makes sense.
yeah, that's a myth. Return the baby to the nest if you can find the nest. Now, the next kind of stage in a baby's or a baby bird's life is the fledgling stage. And this is where a lot of birds are being brought needlessly into the wildlife center. So a fledgling is still a young bird, it's a juvenile. However, they do have their feathers and they're at the stage where they've left the nest. And what they're
Okay.
trying to do now is learn to fly.
Right.
And you remember learning how to walk, which you probably don't.
I don't.
It's awkward at first. There's a lot of fumbling around, there's a lot of falling. And so fledglings can often look like they are injured or in distress when what is actually happening is they're just hopping around, flexing their muscles, flapping their wings, and trying to learn how to fly. And oftentimes, mom and dad are very nearby. They're supervising, they're watching this go down. That's a perfectly safe and normal behavior that should not be interrupted. So if you see a fledgling, you do nothing at all.
Preferably keep your dogs or your pets inside then for a few days, right?
Absolutely. So in this situation, the only time you would interfere is if the fledgling is in a dangerous spot. Let's say they're right next to the road, or if that fledgling is crying out in distress, that might be a sign that mom and dad haven't visited in a while and it is genuinely lost. But for the most part, again, look around. Mom and dad are probably right there. Now, one type of baby that should never be alone is a duck or a goose, or I should say a duckling or a gosling. These are animals that should definitely be with their parents. So if you find one and it's by itself, take note, look around. You know, if you can see mom nearby, you want to try to reunite them. But if the mom is lost, let's say you've been watching that baby and it's been alone for over an hour, or if you know that the mom is dead, that is a baby absolutely in need of rescue. That is not normal. So I would say that's the exception. But this is where, as you can see, age and species are really important to be able to identify because they're going to determine your next steps.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And then does this advice change at all if the animal is, or if you come across an injured animal or an animal that appears injured? Say you can't see blood. What do you do then? What are the steps you should take?
Yeah, that's a good question because sometimes what we perceive as abnormal is not.
Yes.
And this is where it's kind of, important and interesting to learn about the different ways that animals react to distress. Some animals will kind of shut down, others will act out. It just really depends on the critter. But I would say, blood, limping, things like that are going to be your biggest giveaways, though behavioral things can be as well. One that we saw some occasionally, I won't say a lot, at the Wildlife Center is sort of abnormal neurological behavior in birds. So if you're seeing something that just really doesn't look right, maybe the bird is just walking around in really repetitive circles or dragging a part of its body or it's a social species, but it's all by itself. Sometimes these things can be a sign of, an atypical neurological condition. But again, Google's your best friend. Your local wildlife center would love to help you. So I would err on the side of caution before interfering with any wild animal.
Mhm.
Try to collect as much information as you can before you approach, because those interactions can be extremely stressful for the creature, especially if they're already in pain, and can be dangerous for you too. So we want to remember with wildlife always that they can be vectors for disease. They do have claws and teeth and all sorts of different defense mechanisms in their arsenal. So err on the side of caution before approaching.
So what I'm gathering is before you catch any wildlife, baby or adult, make sure that you know what's going on in your surroundings, and make sure that you've watched it for a little bit to know whether or not the parents are around, or whether or not other members or help is nearby.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Just keeping your eyes and ears open for all those different signs.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming on and letting us know. And is this just for spring, or is this the entire year? Because we spoke a bit about sparrows, and they can have numerous clutches a year, can't they?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Spring is kind of the typical time that we see most babies, but it's not the only time. So, a really common local animal are squirrels. And they actually have multiple times a year that they have their babies. One of them's closer to winter. So, you can see baby animals or injured animals all year round, and all of this same advice would apply.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate all the information you have given us. I'll make sure that the contact information for the Calgary Wildlife Rehab Center is attached with the podcast. And yeah, that was great. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Enjoy your local wildlife and have a great spring.
Thank you. You as well. And that is the end of the show for today. Make sure that you answer our trivia question, and that is, how many beats per second can a hummingbird flap its wings? Make sure that you also visit the website at www.thebiomepodcast.com and sign up for our newsletter. That way you won't miss a single episode or a field note. If you want to answer the trivia question, feel free to use the contact form on our website as well. That is it for the show, and we wish you a very great next 2 weeks. But don't forget to ask questions. It is the foundation of science, after all.